Hi everybody. This is actually first actually presentation on looking at inclusive practices in schools. And as you'll see here, this session is called Teaching for All and Reimagining Inclusive Education. And it's going to be through what I call 10 frameworks. And in this session, we're going to look at the first 5 frameworks. And in the next session, we'll be looking at another 5 frameworks. Good news is you're probably doing a lot of this already. But through looking at what these frameworks involve, perhaps you'll see how this all works together as a whole. And there may be, and I hope there'll be some new ideas that you can think about in this session and the next session, and hopefully you can use in your classes. Everywhere in the world, partly through kind of UN approach and policies, the inclusion has been adopted, but it's also become a buzzword as well. And unfortunately, when it comes to education, it's often left that it's us in the classroom as teachers who have to kind of do it. And often it's without a lot of training and support. So, hopefully through this talk, we can look at some of the ways that we can actually support you in the classroom. Now, we could have lots of learners in the classroom, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're actually included. And so we're going to explore this, how we can get beyond just the issue of ensuring that everyone is all together in the classroom, but how they can be effectively engaged when they're there. And as you can see from these images, these are kind of examples of how you might be there, but not necessarily involved. Yeah. Okay, on this next slide, we can see here there's a number of learners. And I'd just like to ask you, which of those learners do you think in these photos might have special educational needs? And now, I'm not going to, I think your intelligent people probably come up with the answer that all of them. and I think that's the point. That now there may be some learners where their specific needs are actually quite obvious. You may notice somebody who may have a visual impairment, somebody may have actually mobility needs, have actually physical needs, or but in the main, we can't know what our learners' needs by just looking at them, and many of those needs are actually invisible as well. So what we can do is kind of notice what's happening in the classroom, and we'll come on to that a little bit later. Yeah. Now, in this next slide, you'll see a whole range of what we often call special educational needs. And these are what we might call our special educational needs labels. Now, on the left-hand side, on purpose, I've put what we might call the sensory needs. That's the hearing impairment, visual impairment, mobility needs. But most of all the others, they're actually about the ways that we learn, and how effective we are in actual supporting these needs. Now, these labels matter. I think it is important that learners are identified, whatever these needs may be. It may be something, learners on the autism spectrum, dyslexia, ADHD, and various others, which you can read here. But I think what's important is once these needs have been identified, what we need to do is look at what are the educational answers. What are the ways that we can support our learners, whatever those needs are, and not get over focused on the kind of medical identification. And I'd like to say a bit more about that in a minute. I say at the top here, this is about access and engagement, and this is one of the themes of this talk. That, as I've said before, you can have learners in the classroom, but what really matters is actually how they're engaged. Now, all these labels, as I say, they can matter, but labels are really for bottles. Labels are for boxes. Labels are for suitcases. I think we need to move on from those labels, and we're not teaching around those labels. We're teaching people, and I think that's what we have to focus on. You'll see in the middle here, there may be one that you haven't heard of, and there may be others, but I think this one in the middle is what's called SEBD, which is actually social, emotional and behavioural issues. And you'll see it's linked to something that nobody can actually pronounce, which in the UK, which is called SMECH, which actually means social, emotional and mental health needs. And I think that this is really, really important, because all of this is a lot of issues that are really, in some respects, from outside the classroom that impact on learning. And in the UK, we actually think it's really important that we link mental health with social and emotional needs. So that's quite a particular one. And as we go through the presentation, there may be some issues that we raise that actually support learners with those different needs. Now, on this next slide is really looking at what we call the medical and social model. Now the medical model, not to be mixed up with the fact that there might be medical interventions, and there could be all sorts of medical interventions, but the issue of what's often called the medical model, it's so much based on medical identification, and it's kind of saying that it's the learner that is the problem and has the problem. And our approach when we talk about the social model, we say that whatever the needs are, it's the obligation of the country, society, and of course in our case, education systems, to actually adapt and include all learners. So we start very much from what we call a social model, which is, and a lot of it is to do with what can we do and change in order to include everyone and ensure they have the best engagement in learning. Now, a lot of this is also about what I'd say is an important kind of, you might even want to call it a mantra or a kind of principle, is, let's start from what learners can do, not from what they can't do. And I think, this is so important, because so much of underachievement in education and in classrooms and schools is really lack of self-esteem, and if you've got a feeling inside your head that you're not going to achieve, that there's going to be failure, then that just reinforces it. So trying to start from much more from a positive point of view, and let's use the strengths and the skills that learners have, and then we can work on areas that obviously need developing and improving. And I think this is an important point. In this next slide, just to give you a kind of visual look at what do we mean by the social model, and you'll see on the left-hand side, the first image really is, it's not about everyone being the same, and it's not about equality, although equality has a part to play in this. But you could see that just by everyone doing the same thing, that's not going to meet everyone's needs. Now, the second one is, and it's often called reasonable adjustment or accommodations, so you're adjusting things, and you can see so that everyone has a chance to actually engage in ways that they can, and you're making adjustments to actually support them. And this second one is a good place to be, because it means education systems are actually making those adjustments to include learners. But if we look at this third part on the right-hand side, maybe really what we need to be about is just remove the barriers. And if we can remove the barriers, then everyone can really engage. Now, the important thing also about this removal of the barriers is we actually shift who chooses, who decides. If we do everything we can to remove the barriers, and that's easy to say, and not always so easy to actually do, but if we can remove those barriers, then the learners themselves can make the choices, and I think that's an important aspect to what we're talking about in inclusive practices. Okay, these are kind of introductory ideas, just to explain a few issues around inclusive practices. Now we're going to look at the frameworks, and you'll see on this slide in this session, we're going to look at the first 5 frameworks. And those 5 are, as you can read here, actually celebrating diversity, a focus on learning outcomes and achievable learning outcomes, something we've already kind of referred to, talking about access and engagement. Actually, clutter is an issue I'd like to raise with you. And I think that as I explain what actually clutter is in the classroom, I think you'll find this quite interesting. At least I hope so. and then what I call encouraging the learner's voice. And as you can see on the right-hand side, you've got an image of what all those frameworks are in a kind of pie chart. So you know, in a sense, I'm giving you options here as well. You can read it in terms of just as words and text, but you can see it as an image as well. Yeah. Okay, so the first framework is actually celebrating diversity, and I think that this is kind of the first one in recognizing our differences, and we're recognizing also what we have that's the same, but it's recognizing our differences, and actually seeing that the differences that our learners bring to the classroom context are actually very, very helpful in learning. You know, and we often talk in the language classroom about making mistakes are really good. You know, it's something we can use in the classroom, a gift, in fact, for teachers and learners, is just because, you know, the more learners make a mistake, whatever a mistake is, some people call it a mistake, you know, and we kind of learn from that. It shows that we're engaged in the process and we're trying things and we're learning things. And I think, you know, our differences should be seen as a gift as well. You know. Now, if we look at the next image, and you'll see we have fish who are swimming around. I just wonder again if you just take a few seconds and just think about, you know, what are some of those differences, you know. And of course, this is fish swimming in a tank. But if you could think about what that might mean for our classrooms as well, in terms of the differences, and if you just think about it for a few seconds, yeah. Okay, and there are all sorts of differences here as well. I mean, they're all fish in the same way as all our learners in the classroom are all human. But you know, we're moving in different ways at different pace. You know, some are interacting with others, and some are working on their own. And you know, I think there are lots of things here that say to us about our classrooms. And on this next slide, you know, put it in a kind of broader context about our diverse world. You know, and you know, we talk a lot about how our nature is diverse, and biodiversity, about different plants and different animals and different species. You know, as human beings, we're different. You know, we're different in various ways in terms of different parts of the world that we come from, the different ways we look, all sorts of things. I think, you know, it's really important to think about this. This also applies in the ways that we learn as well. And I think that this is one of the things we really need to focus on. Another issue, and you may not understand these terms yet, but I hope it will become clear. You know, when we talk about inclusion, we also talk about the intersection of different ways that we need to be included. Now, inclusion is not just about some people achieve well and some people don't achieve well. There might be all sorts of ways. It might be an issue that there are issues around why boys might not be achieving as well as they might. or girls. It may be that you know, obviously in some countries and contexts, it's very, you know, it's really hard for girls to get to school in the first place for all sorts of reasons. You know, there may be mental health issues here as well. You know, there may be you know, the accessibility issues as well. You know, so you know, I think we want to look at the fact that you know, for many young people, actually getting to school, and then once they're in school, can be like a kind of roller coaster of quite significant issues that actually block and impact negatively on learning. And so we need to think about all these issues as well. Now, and one issue that has been spoken about quite a lot at the moment is a concept called actually neurodiversity. And what this means is it's often it's not what you think, but how you think. And if you see in this slide, you know, quite often our approaches in the classroom mean that, you know, we're not actually including learners in the way they need to learn, and also understanding that the different ways that we need to actually process information should be seen as a natural process of the ways as humans we all learn. Now, there has been quite a lot of issues going around about the idea of learning styles is one that you know, there's a lot of research that has kind of shown that what we mean by learning styles, and you know, there isn't really evidence to show that that learners are actually, you know, certain types of learners only. I think we're all different types of learners, and we need different things at different times. And this is certainly not about trying to lock learners into, well, you seem to be a visual learner, so you need to do visual activity. That's a very narrow way of looking at learning in any way. But it is about trying to ensure that we have a variety of options in the way we present, and the way that we allow our learners to engage. Yeah, and a lot of this is about the choices they can make. But I will actually say a lot more about that in the second session. Yeah. Okay, now the second framework is about clear and achievable outcomes, and I think, you know, needing to understand this, it's not just end point of a day, a week, a year, you know, etc. It's about how learners can make progress as well. So and I think actually looking at the ways that we can make progress is really important. And a lot of this needs to be not just here's the course book, here's the syllabus, let's do it. Have you achieved it or haven't you achieved it? But it's, you know, how are we engaging our learners and thinking about their learning as well? You know, what can be agreed in terms of progress between what we want to do as teachers and what learners actually do. Yeah? And of course, a lot of this is linked to, you know, kind of can do as well. You know, but again, it's coming back to this point about let's start from what the learner can do rather than what they can't do. Yeah. Now, in this next slide, you'll see what I call a classroom anywhere in the world. And again, you might like to look at this for a minute and see what you think. It's a bit exaggerated, but I'm sure that you might recognize some of these things from your own classrooms. It's certainly a very busy classroom, and I'd like to just ask the question, what's going on in this classroom and what's not happening? Now, you might think everything is happening here except learning. And in the top right-hand corner, you'll see that the person who's running the classroom, the teacher, what she wants to do is escape from teaching, and that might be how the teacher feels. Yeah. But what I want to say, I think we need to have a bit of care. because your answer might be what's not happening, there's not learning happening. Well, it's almost impossible that no learning is happening. And I think there's a real danger in us kind of prejudging what we think learners are understanding, even if it's clearly not following the course book or the lesson plan that you have planned in the day. But I think the other thing I want to say about this image is that, and this might be obvious, but it can be being in a classroom, and especially in a large classroom, can be a kind of a not so easy place for all learners. It could be, and especially learners who may be identified as having specific needs and the autism spectrum, or have interactional needs and things like that. So I suppose what this is really all about as well is how can we shift this seem to be busy and not very learning focused classroom into one that is learning and focused. A large part of the problem really is actually learning in classrooms, and this is not really anyone's fault. It's certainly not your fault as a teacher. It's just kind of the way it is, and the way it always has been. That though we often talk about, oh well, all the learners are different and understand are different learners, but then we actually teach as if they're all exactly the same. And how can we begin to change that? Now, for some learners, classroom learning is just right, and many people they need support, of course, in learning, but they kind of get it what learning is. For others, maybe the first thing they want to do is escape and run out the classroom. Others might be really, the actual, a lot of teaching in classroom is what we often call lockstep. And that means that almost everybody is doing more or less the same thing at the same time, even if they're doing things in groups and doing interesting things, but they're expected to basically do the same thing. And for some learners, they might be thinking in a totally different way. That just doesn't fit their needs. Now, maybe the largest group is learners who are kind of suffering in silence, and I think there are, how do we meet their needs? How do we know what their needs are, and how do we meet their needs? Now, especially in English language teaching, there's so much of English language teaching is very active, and it's very busy. And it seems to be geared mainly for extroverts. And obviously in a language classroom, we want people to talk, we want people to engage, we want people to do. But how do we reach our more introverted learners as well? And I think this is kind of an important issue. Okay, and I think if we look at this next slide, there's just a little bit of text, so you might just like to read that for a few seconds yourself. And I think the key point is this little bit in red. Is now obviously we have our curriculums and our syllabus, and we follow that, and we have to start from where we are in our classrooms. But I think a really important issue is about that we don't sift and sort our learners based on predetermined judgments about what we think they can and can't learn. And I think that's a kind of key issue. You'll see this is taken from a quote from a book that was focused on kind of South African context, but I think this applies anywhere in the world. And so how do we move from this what might be a kind of locked-in way of expectations of learners to one that really tries to actually bring out the best in everyone? Now, looking at this next slide, another way of reframing our special educational needs labels is in these 5 areas, and I think this is still another, if you like, some kind of labelling, but it actually puts it in a broader context than looking at specifically in terms of these isolated special educational needs labels. And these 5 areas, as you can see here: cognition and learning, the behavioural emotional, as I've already mentioned, communication and interaction, and then the sensory and physical, and then what might be these external factors from outside the classroom, or social exclusion factors. I think if we can look at how can we look at kind of reframing the way we're teaching and learning into those 5 areas, and to be a bit more actually specific. One of the reasons why it's not enough just to get the identification of special educational needs is that even if somebody is identified as being dyslexic or being on the autism spectrum, a lot of the learning needs actually go across all those labels as well, and really, it's really important that schools are able to work with actually professionals from outside the school, with educational psychologists and speech therapists and all sorts of people from actually support agencies. But what we need to do as teachers is focus on teaching and learning, and that's where our skills are. And a lot of the issues across all the learners who are often identified as having special educational needs is, it's like, if you look at this next slide, it's around how we organise and get learners on task and doing tasks, and it's a lot to do with memory, and a lot of learners with special educational needs have a different sort of what we call working memory. And they have different ways that they need to process information. It may be a lot of what we call receptive and expressive language as well, in terms its challenges are around our reading and writing and text-based approaches. It's understanding the kind of pragmatics of language as well. A lot of it might be around concentration and focus. Now, so some people say, for example, learners who may be identified as having ADHD haven't got enough focus and concentration. A lot of people have said, well, actually, it's quite the opposite. They've got far too much, and it's how you organise that. And of course, it may be to do with learning, ways of thinking and learning as well. Again, in the UK, we have this. If you look at this next slide, a pyramid, which is a kind of paradigm for teaching for all, and it's a kind of 3-way framework. Is that as you see at the bottom, the biggest, the wave 1 is we can address most of our learners' needs through what we call good actual quality teaching and learning. And I think as long as we're clear, as long as we've got our learners engaged in what they seem to be engaged in, focusing what they can do well, and then trying to ensure that we work on where they need to develop, we're probably going to reach most of our learners. Now, that isn't enough, of course. And wave 2 might be, well, what additional support can we give to our learners? Now, that might be additional support to lots of learners through after-school clubs, or it might be some kind of specific activities to be involved in, and that's really important. And then we have what we call wave 3, which is very specific interventions, which may be really necessary to support individuals who are just not getting the kind of support either in the classroom or even what we might do after school. Now, there are lots of different ways that we might organise this support, and this is something that we can look at in more detail. Now, I think what we can really look at is, and if you look at this first slide, it's an approach that's called "What can teachers notice?" And this kind of takes us away from really having to really focus on the medical identification, helpful and useful though that might be, is that what can we see as teachers? And you'll see, if you look at this list, a whole number of things that you might what I mean by what we can notice. Does the work involve a lot of reading and writing, and are there some learners who are really not really engaging on that? Are there difficulties with attention and focus? Are there difficulties with sitting still? Is somebody having a problem reading from the board? Now, is that something to do with the way teachers are writing on the board, or is it something that the person is having a problem with? Other issues around following instructions, and you can see there's a whole list here. And I'm sure you can come up with your own list in terms of your own learners here. Now, this starts kind of from what the learner can't do. And perhaps we could reframe this, and if we look at the next slide, is could we actually do it from thinking of what the learner can do? What is the learner doing particularly well? How is she doing it? Does she have a particular way of engaging with a particular task? What skills and processes seem to be working? Can we do more of that then? So, and then that again shifts the emphasis to let's start from what the person can do. Now, this is also really quite important for us as teachers, because often when we think about learners who may be underachieving or learners who may be not having the focus you would like them to have, they may be getting up and moving around the class, you're thinking of problem. Can we reframe this as well in our own thinking as teachers, rather than seeing what's the problem, but you say, what do I notice? And what's interesting about what I notice, and through that, what are my learners saying to me about the way I'm teaching, and what can I do to change how I teach? Now, there's a nice little phrase that's often used. It's called it goes like this: if you always do what you've always done, you always get what you've always got. Now, if what you're doing is working and it's working well, fine, go on and do it, and why change it? But if something's not working, then let's look at doing things in different ways, and maybe that little phrase kind of sums that up a little bit. Okay, now the next framework is what we call access and engagement, and again, you can read what this says, but this basically saying access is removing kind of physical obstacles and barriers to get learners into school, but they're not always physical and obstacles. In most countries there's a kind of legal framework as well in terms of what should be there in terms of access, but which doesn't mean it always happens and it's always applied. But it might be there are ways of teaching and learning that become a barrier to access as well. While engagement is very much about the actual nature of the learning and the quality of the learning. Now, there may be things as teachers we can do in terms of access, although a lot of that might be whole school policy and things that have to be in place. But engagement is definitely something we can do as teachers. Okay, so I think we're just going to spend a little bit of time looking at some aspects of what we mean by engagement and how we can actually support engagement. Now, there are a million ways that we can support engagement, and I'm just going to look at a few ideas here, really. One is, if we look at this next slide, this is what I've called an individual and group education plan. Although this example was for an individual education learning plan, which we often call IEPs. And this is, in the UK, IEPs are usually over about 6 weeks, which is about, in terms of a term, it's kind of half a term, which has felt that kind of period is long enough and short enough to actually identify issues and actually offer support. Now, this is just one example of an individual education plan that a school might actually produce. And in this case, there were some issues identified in terms of behaviour and how a learner was interacting. And so it starts off with looking at, what are the issues and what kind of support is necessary. What are the aims and outcomes over the 6 weeks that we might want the learner to achieve? How will we know if we've made progress? What kind of resources do we need to support that? Both human resources and actually material resources. and then what are the outcomes we're looking at. But of course, this is very much, you know, from the school, from the class, from the teacher. But it's really, really important that this also involves the individual themselves in giving some response to this, and actually parents and carers as well involved in this. And we also talk in the UK about having a multi-agency approach, and so it's really, really important that schools, although the school's purpose, as I've said already, is really providing the educational support, but actually working with external professionals is very much part of that, and as much as that can be done. Now, what you can also do, this is, as I said, very much an individual education plan. If you would then assess to what extent after 6 weeks that the intended outcomes have been achieved. If not, then perhaps it requires another plan. But it might be that you can take it away from just the individual and call it a group plan. You might identify various ways that a whole number of learners are not actually achieving, and so how can we do things that might actually identify the needs across a number of learners, and in some ways that can be more inclusive as well. Because you're not actually identifying and it's an individual who needs this, but it's actually many learners as well. But you might do it with the same approach. Now, there are lots of different ways you could have an individual education plan, and as I say, that this is just an example that you might find helpful. In the UK, I work with an organisation called actually NASEN, which stands for actually National Association for actually Special Educational Needs. And they've came up. They're the main organisation that supports schools in the UK, in terms of what kind of support and provision is appropriate. And they work with teachers and schools as well across the whole spectrum of special educational needs. And they see their approach very much about inclusive practices as much as anything else. And now they've come up with a schema which is not exactly new, but I think it's just simple and quite important, that and you can see from this next image that it's about involving a whole range of different people, including something that they call a SENCO, and the term SENCO stands for actually Special Educational Needs Coordinators, and they're somebody in the school who's in the class, who would have their own classes and teaches, and it's important that they are actually very much rooted in the classroom, but they're also on the school leadership, so so that it really goes across the school as well. Now they've come up with this approach that is called, and it's very simple. It's assess, plan, do, review, and that means assess the learning needs, not the special needs. Plan lessons, plan interventions, do them, and then review them to see what's happened. If aims have been met, then go on and do other things. If not, you need to start again. Well, you always start again. So this whole cycle and process of assess, plan, do, review is there, and teachers across different subjects, as well as other school staff, and as well as external people such as educational psychologists and speech therapists and many others who might support the different kinds of interventions are all involved. But it's this simple message of assess, plan, do, review, in as much as how can we meet our learners' needs. Another way of looking at this approach to, let's start from what the learner can do rather than what they can't do. You might like to look at this image. Now it's focused on dyslexia, but it could apply to any kind of learning needs. Now, one of the things around many learners with special educational needs is it's often, and when we're thinking about cognitive needs, and dyslexia as an example, it's very little to do with intelligence. And because in fact it's quite the opposite. Many learners who may be identified with dyslexia often have above average intelligence. But what's often the case is that there's a gap between what it seems they can do and what they are actually able to achieve. And how do we fill that gap? And that gap is usually in reading and writing. Now, dyslexia isn't actually a reading and writing problem. It's evidenced through reading and writing. There's many other things in terms of working memory, in terms of challenges with sequencing, with organisation of work, and lots of other things. But it's because of so much of it comes back to our looking at our classrooms, is really focused on reading and writing as the major skills that are actually assessed. That's where it becomes a problem. Now, if you look at this image, now on the left-hand side, you'll see all the areas which a learner may have a weakness in, which is in, let's say, sequencing, in organisation, in phonological processing. There's all sorts of things, and these are things that we have to work with our learners on and try and improve. But on the right-hand side is all the fantastic stuff that the learner may actually excel in. And you'd find that a learner who may be identified with dyslexia usually is really great at kind of seeing the big picture. It's really one of the issues in terms of reading and writing, because they kind of see things in 3D that most of our books are not in 3D, and that's where it becomes a challenge. Working on systems and generally, of course, they excel much better in speaking and as well, and doing things in different ways. Now, that image that I'm showing you here is like a mind map, and so a learner might actually, rather than write a piece of text, they might kind of identify the issues in a mind map way, and then speak about it and talk about it. They might want to present things using actually PowerPoint, like you'll see here as well, and that all might be helpful. So again, it's looking at, well, what can the learner do well, then how can we use that in order to actually work on the areas that need to be developed. And if you look at the next image, and that just gives, if you like, 6 golden rules, if you like, in terms of engaging students, engaging learners, and you can read these and see how you might see to what extent you do apply that already in your teaching, and to what extent there might be other things that here that you might like to think about and make a change. Okay, the next one and going to focus on, and it's this word clutter. So what do I mean by this word? Now, what it is really is anything that might be an obstacle and barrier to learning is actually clutter. But let's just look at a few examples which may be obvious in the classroom. So one issue that might be a barrier might be teachers' instructions. And I think, as we all know, we give instructions and then we give more instructions often, and then we give more instructions, and we expect our learners to actually process all of these, and we might put them into groups, and then we're giving them more information and more things to do. So I think really understanding, and it comes back to us, what can teachers notice, is really, are our learners actually receiving the information that we're giving? If they're not, then we need to do something else. But I think maybe we can be really aware and try and give instructions, one by one and kind of clearly, and make sure that our instructions are not a barrier, because you can have the best activity in the world, but if your instructions are not getting through, then they're going to be useless. And so that's where it becomes actually clutter. Another aspect of clutter can be, and this is what all teachers do, is teacher talking time, and all teachers talk too much. And how can we? Now I do think the teacher's voice, especially in the language classroom, is very, very important, and the teacher's model of what he or she is saying is really, really important. But if what we want to try and do is reduce the amount of time that we talk and increase the time that our learners talk or do any activity. So kind of looking at our talking time is part of reducing how we actually declutter. Now for other learners, maybe seeing things too much in the written script might be clutter, and they need more visuals. For others, it might be the visuals are clutter. So it's a question really of understanding our learners and seeing what, is what we are doing, is it meaningful? Is it promoting learning, or is it actually impeding it and creating clutter? And I think just thinking about, am I actually cluttering, and how can I declutter? Can really be helpful. And that might be in various ways. And I'd like to, if we look at the next slide, I'd like to look at another aspect of how we might declutter. Now, learners come into your classroom, and so often we just expect them to be ready for learning. And open your books, page 21, and we're going to start. And we don't actually take into account, what time of day is it? What's been the previous lesson? Has it been physical education that, they're really energized and now you want them to do something really focused on thinking? Can that happen straight away? Has something happened at home? Is there something that might have actually impacted on them that they're upset about or is problematic? Is it near lunchtime? Are they thinking about lunchtime and what's going to happen next? And just a kind of simple technique that might be useful is asking the learners, what state are you in for learning? And the way I do this, if you look at this, we've got the unhappy face and the happy face. And I often ask learners you might put this on the board or put it on a flip chart or something, and ask them to come down and actually put where on that line are they between unhappiness, which would be not in a state for learning, to happiness, to really ready to go. Now, if most of your learners are on the left-hand side, then that says we need to do something. We need to do some lead-in, some warm-up, and you might do that anyway, but you really have to do it to get them engaged. But if they're all, from the middle upwards, then maybe you can go straight in. But I think the important point here is that we're asking our learners what state they're in for learning. We're showing we care. We're trying to get them to focus. And if you do something like this, then, spending a few minutes on this can be really useful, that then you can then go into what you want to do. And so it's just another aspect of trying to declutter. But there could be all sorts of things. And as I say, just look at your own lessons, look at the way you're working, and I'm sure you'll find lots of examples of how you can declutter. Let's look at another example, which is looking at what you're going to do in the lesson, the content of lesson, and how we might declutter. Now, here's a little text, which you obviously see as what we call mirror language, and the text is kind of backward writing. But some learners might look at a text and that's how they might see any text. So what I'd like you to do is, if you can, you don't have to write anything, but if you can just try and read the text and get the meaning of the text. But also, as you're doing this, just think of how you could make this more accessible text for your learners and for some learners. And again, this might be another example of decluttering. Okay, now I'm sure you'll come up with all sorts of ways in which we can make this text more accessible and therefore it be kind of decluttered. But here's a kind of example, which you might look at. So you can see there's various ways that I've approached this. One is to introduce some visuals into the text and put some visuals in particular key parts of the text that might actually help many learners to actually understand. the words. Now there may be an issue of some of the vocabulary isn't known, of course, and of course in any good reading text you do pre-reading activities and go into the text in various ways. This is about a day at a holiday camp. This is about what would you expect to find there, and you do all sorts of things. You might work on some vocabulary, and all that would be helpful. But what I've also done here is, for many learners, often it's these little words that are problematic as well, the words that can be reversed, and especially learners who may be identified with dyslexia. That's often an issue. No, on, and words that has the same was and saw and words like that. So some of those words are put in red. So that's a kind of color coded for learners. Other words which are kind of vocabulary words that they may or may not know are put in green. So they can begin to help identify different words through different colors. Other things like trying to put each sentence on the same line as much as that is possible. There's some numbering of sentences that might be helpful as well. And you'll see in the corner I've got a little mobile phone there. So maybe the text can be in audio form as well. So again, this is just looking at kind of a variety of approaches that how do we make meaning meaningful, and how do we use what might be a kind of cluttered text into one that then becomes uncluttered and then becomes comprehensible. And again, it's looking at various ways. Now I call this easifying the text, not simplifying the text. And I think that's an important difference. So everyone's working with the same text, but you may do it in slightly different ways. Okay, now the last one is, as we say, the last framework in this session is ensuring the appropriate space for the learner's voice. And I think this is very, very important, that how much can we engage the learner themselves in making choices about the lesson and about their interests as well, and not just as an individual, but working with other learners. And I talk about what's called a learning-centered approach, which is a bit different from learner-centered. Learner-centered often tends to mean that, and obviously the lesson needs to be focused on the learner, so it's learner-centered. Otherwise, it's pointless. But it's not trying to impose one particular approach and one particular methodology. Often learner-centered goes hand in hand with what we call autonomy and learner independence. Now that does matter, and that's important, but learning-centered could mean that any approach that engages the learner is what really matters. Okay, now we'll see we will explore a lot more of those learning-centered approaches in the next session. So that's our 10 frameworks, and as you can see, we've looked at 5, and we'll look at another 5 in the next session. But you can see it's in the kind of slices of the pie, and we'll focus more on that pie in the second session. So just to finish, this is all, inclusion really is all about what we might call 1A and 3 E's. So the first A is access, and that is, yes, the access is about ensuring our learners can actually be in the class in the school in the first place. Of course, access could be a physical thing, but it can also be ensuring access in class as well. And there are things we can do around that. But there are three E's that go with the access, and the first E is engagement, and ensuring that the nature of the learning and the quality of the learning is as involving and just right for all our learners. The second E is empowering, and that's empowering ourselves as teachers, but also empowering our learners to ensure they have the best kind of education possible. And the third E is enabling, and again, so it's actually again linked with empowering and ensuring that we have the best skills possible. And this session really was just looking at some of those those issues that can actually support our access, our engagement, our empowering and enabling to have the best kind of inclusive practices possible for our learners and for our schools.